right, so welcome everyone to another episode of Blast from the Past. Today, we're happy to have former Congressman Steve Russell, a Republican from Oklahoma's 5th District, with us today, and we're going to be talking to him about his career before Congress, especially his military service, and after that, we're going to be discussing his tenure in Congress. So thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
All right, so my first question starts right at the beginning of your career, and it's what inspired you to enlist in the Army back in 1985, and are there any leadership skills there that you learned during your 21-year career that helped you be successful in politics?
Well, from the time of my youth, I wanted to be a soldier. I wanted to fly, but my eyes were bad, so I couldn't do it in the service. But I really enjoyed the infantry, and I guess no one in my neighborhood was surprised that I became a soldier. Watching me grow up as a kid, most of the adults in my neighborhood were World War II veterans. They fascinated me with tales from all their experiences. So it was really interesting, and I enjoyed military service a great deal. It was how I was able to afford to go to college with a Army ROTC scholarship, and that was instrumental in me getting an education. And then I was able to. They got their money's worth. I had a 4-year obligation, and it turned into 21 years. A veteran of several excursions, and I got to see a lot of the world, and worked with some great people. Being able to work as a member of a team, work with every type of ethnicity in our nation, stationed all over the country, and even other parts of the world. You really view America as much more of a whole rather than its individual parts, and for that I was very grateful.
Thank you. All right, so Armin, you can do your first question.
Thanks again, Congressman Russell, for doing this. My first question is, how did you tackle your 2018 reelection campaign? And is there anything specific that you would have done differently if you'd had the chance to use hindsight versus
Well,
Kendra
um, I've certainly looked at it a lot. I think part of it was the changing demographic of an urban area. It's very rare that capital cities remain conservative, for one, just because of the urban makeup. But we did have a lot of support, and I think an off election year is certainly a factor. In the 2020 election, there were 36,000 more Republican votes than in the 2018 election. Just 1,600 of those would have changed the course of my election. It is what it is. I certainly subscribe to any endeavor, whether military service or political service, is exactly that. It's service to the country. So when the nation said that it no longer needed my services, I was glad to go home. 3.5 decades of serving my country. It was nice to come home. So I think I look at the election itself. Money was a factor at the close of the race, but as I had mentioned before we started the recording, money is not everything. I had won most of my elections on reduced funds comparatively. In my break-in elections in both the state Senate in Oklahoma and then in Congress, I was the underdog and was outspent in those elections. So I never really viewed money as a factor, as the deciding factor, although it helps to be able to get the message out. I think there were a number of state issues in my own personal election that really have nothing to do with the federal level, but it shows that the electorate itself, they really don't know the differences between what is state authority and what is federal authority. So factors like local education issues, which we were having at the time, those had a factor, and then you had some different things economically that were occurring. So those might have been a factor, but I don't know that I really would have changed anything. I've learned in my own personal faith, the 75th Psalm says that we should not lift our horn on high, neither speak with a stiff neck, for promotion does not come from the east or west or the south. It comes from the Lord. He puts down one and he lifts up another, whether good or bad or indifferent. The office is just that. It's an office, and it's an honor to serve. So if one individual steps out of it, it doesn't mean that the world stops. It just means that somebody else is in that office with that mantle of responsibility. And my value as a man and as a person and as a believer was never in question by an election. That was never on the ballot.
Thank you, Congressman. That was very good.
Thank you. So my second question for you pertains to one of the biggest moments in your military career, for sure, and that is, can you tell us a little bit about your role, what you can tell us at least, in the capture of Saddam Hussein, which you recounted in your book, We Got Him?
Well, it was, we never imagined that as we went into Iraq, that our task force would play a central role in his capture. When we got to Tikrit, Iraq, which was his hometown, and his birth village of Oja was within our area of operations, what we quickly learned was that he was being harbored and sheltered by his hometown connections. And they formed a network of individuals, about a half a dozen families that he had known from his youth in the 1950s, through his political life, through marriage, through long association. And these families were the network of what became the resistance that he formed, and were protecting him. We also learned that they were operating in the area where we were. So while we never imagined we would play any role in his capture, it became clear early on that if it were possible to get him and he were in the area of Tikrit, then yeah, let's work on that. Let's go after that. No one unit or individual can claim sole responsibility for his capture, but we certainly had a wonderful participation in that with a great number of teams from two particular Special Operations Forces teams, regular units that we worked with in the area. And we got on things very, very quickly. I mean, you go back and I look through the recorded news coverage and the Time magazines, all the different things that were going on at the time, and they were clearly tracking our hunt accurately. And then we also sensed, certainly after October, that we were closing that ring from a number of big captures. We thought, okay, all of this network of family associates, while they were not really good at protecting, or they were good at protecting Saddam, but not good at protecting themselves. So we thought, if we go after that network, like Pokemon, we collect the whole set and see if we can get next to him, and it might lead us to Saddam. And that was largely the strategy, and it worked. And then it culminated there in December, where we got incredible tips on key individuals that we had been seeking for 5 and 6 months, and that rapidly led to the location where he was. It wasn't the first time we nearly got him. There were a couple of other raids where we got very, very close. As you know, and it is detailed in as you mentioned, the story in the memoir We Got Him, which Simon & Schuster published. But it was an incredible honor to not only lead warriors that were participating in that, but to whatever the Iraq War became, we knew that this guy was bad news. We knew, after attacking every neighboring country except for Syria, killing 300,000 of his countrymen and political opponents, elimination of the Marsh Arabs, 40,000 of his own tribal opponents, killed his own son-in-law. This was not a nice guy. He had been a pariah on the world for decades, and if it was not then, it was going to come to account at some point. I still believe that. And in retrospect, some people say, well, look at what all happened after. Well, what happened afterwards were independent decisions. And, you could say, well, Mussolini, he made the trains run on time. Yes, he did. But that didn't mean that was good for Italy. And Saddam was certainly not good for Iraq. I can't imagine him being in play in many of the factors that happened later. So I told my soldiers the last time we were assembled as a task force, I said, look, whatever becomes of this war and whatever people decide, whatever the nation decides to do, no one can ever take away what you've accomplished. And as other young men your age look back on their lives, and women, we had 17 women in our task force. I just said, as others look back on their lives in your generation, they'll look on you and wish they were you, because you went and served and you did your duty and you did it well and you accomplished extraordinary things, and no one can ever take that away from you. And that's still how we largely feel about it.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate that. So, Armin, you can ask your second question.
Yeah, thank you for that, Congressman. So my second question is again on the electoral side of things. So what do you think about Stephanie Bice's victory over now former Congresswoman Kendra Horn last November, and how do you think it impacts the future for Oklahoma County Republicans over the next few years?
Well, I think it's good. Excuse me. I think it's good because one, Oklahoma is still largely conservative in social makeup. I mean, you have fiscal conservatives and you have different folks, but socially, Oklahoma is still a largely conservative state. Urban areas can have differences on what that means, but I think in the election, I mean, you had 36,000 more Republicans turn out in the presidential election. Well, okay, that obviously made a difference in the vote. I think a number of folks assumed because I had overwhelming support in the Republican primaries, over 80% of the vote, that, yeah, okay, he's got this, he's going to be fine. But it came down to literally tenths of a percent in the final election. That's our system. That's the way it works. But going forward, I think it does show the importance of turning out your base for each political party. Ideas matter. And having your voice heard, you can't just sit idle and assume that that's the case. You got to get out and do the work and do the hard work. I think in terms of the census and redistricting, that it will be very important for a number of reasons. The homogeneity, if I could say that, of the 5th district is really urban. It always has been. You have Oklahoma City and its greater environs that make up that district, but yet you have some areas that are just outside of that would be better served with the more rural lawmakers. So I think you'll see that happen. I think you'll see areas of the 5th district that are clearly connected to the state's capital will now be included in the redistricting, and then you will see rural areas that will be aligned with those that deal with rural issues. And regardless of which party that goes to, I think that will serve the constituency well, because those are the issues they care about.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask my next question now, and it kind of builds off what you said about joining the military and the leadership experience you got during that time. And the question is, what drove you to really get into a career in politics? And and on top of that, once you were in Congress, is there any single accomplishment in Congress that you're proud of, legislatively or working together?
Oh, sure. I think when I was in the service, I mean, you always had a political interest because you never knew where the nation was going to send you. And you always listened to what people were saying on the national level, because their statements or their desires on foreign policy, you could literally find yourself the next morning being alerted and sent to a place that you'd never been, or a language you didn't know how to speak, or whatever. That's the soldier's lot. So you're always very tuned in to foreign policy. And I think what surprises a lot of people about the military is they imagine, we are these knuckle dragger types that, okay, in case of war, break glass, bring us out. But our military is very educated. They read a lot. They study hard their profession and their different things, just like anybody else. You would expect a lawyer to know law. You would expect a physician to know medicine. You would expect any professional to study the journals and look at the case studies and the different things of their work. It's no different in the military. And so your typical American military leader is very well versed in American politics and very well versed in American history, is very well versed in foreign policy. He's largely been to all the places that, you know, are concerns for the national interest of our country, because that's where they serve. That's where the front lines are, or that's where the bases are, or whatever it might be. So you always have a political interest. And I never imagined that I would, I mean, sure, you know, you sit around and you think, yeah, you know, I wonder if I would ever do anything like that. I mean, that's all of us do that. But I never really seriously thought, oh yeah, I'm going to become a congressman someday. That it had really not been something that I saw. But then the Saddam capture and a lot of those events, historically, it really did change the trajectory of my life. It it created different things where people wanted to hear the story and they wanted to hear different things, and then I was approached politically because of that. Um, and I remember when I first put my toe in the state Senate, which was, you know, nothing to balk at. I just thought, you know, I paid the Oklahoma citizenship penalty for the entire time I was in the Army, and you know, I'd be in one state and taxed by two, you know, and I was just tired of that. So I wanted yeah, in the Soldiers and Sailors Relief Act that was passed in World War II, soldiers weren't taxed if they were serving. And it's kind of a shuffle game anyway. Okay, federal money pays federal soldiers, federal taxes go to pay federal soldiers, whatever it is. And we were looking at that as warriors. And I thought, I wonder if I could get the law changed. At that time, you had about a third of the country that did not tax their serving military. So that was, I thought, you know, I'm going to run and see if I can change that. And so I did. I ran. I found myself elected in a five-way race, was predicted to come in third. I won. And then the first year I was in office in a bipartisan, very split legislature, I was able to advance that and I got it passed through a Republican-controlled legislature with a Democratic governor, and it was a tax reduction. So not an easy task, but it was the right thing to do. And to this day, our military that serve in Oklahoma uniform, or just, you know, serve Oklahoma in uniform, they're not taxed on their pay. And so that was an accomplishment that I was proud of. Advanced a number of other things on adoption reform when I was at the state level. 3 of my 5 children are adopted. Um, I was really kind of struck by some of the things that with our local district attorneys that they were finding fraud in the adoption process, and were really, it was tantamount to human trafficking. They were bidding children, you know, unknown to the families. Um, you know, the family would be told, okay, you know, the adoption is going to cost this. And if that was higher than what the other family was told, then they would abandon that family and go to the highest bidder. It was very criminal activity. So we put together an adoption task force between the 2 houses in the state legislature, and we passed some very good laws that help clean up the human trafficking aspect of adoption and made it more streamlined. So those were some things at the state level that come to mind. And then, you know, federally, I always felt more comfortable on the federal issues because that's where most of my experience militarily had been, global. And I was very comfortable with foreign policy, with national policy, with all of those things, and really enjoyed the work a great deal. My time in the Armed Services Committee was very rewarding. A lot of things were accomplished that, you know, didn't have any legislative fanfare or any of that stuff in terms of um, the shoring up of Eastern Europe, working with key Eastern NATO allies, working hand in hand with the defense ministers and others and the foreign ministers on very difficult issues, and was able to bring that back. And we turned it into policy and got changes that were needed that strengthened the NATO alliance and did other things. The the elimination of the effort to privatize air traffic control against my own party and my own president. I had great concerns of the defense aspects of that. There was a lot of information that people didn't realize that was a danger to our national airspace, not just for the general aviation community, but more importantly to our military aviation. And they just didn't know it and they didn't see it. So you had all these big lobbies from the airlines and others that were trying to privatize it and put it in the hands of a 13-member board rather than it diminished the powers of the executive branch. It diminished the oversight of Congress, and it was just wrong. So I had a bad habit of reading bills while I was in Congress and found a lot of bad things in the policy. Was able to go case by case and educate enough. Worked very well on the other side of the aisle with Matt Cartwright and Jerry Connolly and others. And then we locked up a good segment of our own caucus on the Republican side. And we were under tremendous pressure from the White House and from leaders and others to knock it off. But it was the wrong thing to do if we went that direction. So we did the right thing rather than what would have been convenient, and very, very proud of that. I was given the Handcraft Award for my efforts from the Association of Airplane Owners and Pilots and others, and it was a great honor to know that one guy can rally a whole Congress against something and stop it, and we did that. And those are a couple of things: the foreign policy work, the defense work, the aviation work. Those were a lot of the things that I played in while I was there.
Thank you very much. That was definitely our most detailed account out of all the interviews of all the things you actually worked on during your time in service. And it's always very refreshing to hear about someone who served and really focused on getting things done for the people and constituency.
Well, I had a large amount of legislation that was signed into law. I had 6 different pieces of legislation under 2 presidents that were signed into law, and had over 50 amendments that made it into law. I foolishly thought when you went there, you were supposed to do the work. And so that, but doing the work is not always what people want. Doing it with honor and integrity is not always what people want. Political parties can frame things in certain ways, but my integrity was never on the ballot and my reputation was never up for sale. And so I always looked at it: if the nation still needs me, I'll serve. And if they don't, I'm going to go home, I'm going to fly, and I'm going to live in peace. And that's what I've been doing. I've been enjoying it.
This plays into my next question, which is just a fun little question here. And it's, how have you stayed involved in the community since leaving the House? And what hobbies have you found most fulfilling? As our viewers might not know, you can maybe talk a little bit about your pilot. You have a pilot's license, so.
Yeah, I got involved with, I always wanted to learn to fly, but being nearsighted, I became an infantryman instead. And but it was always a passion from my youth. And Ralph Abraham, my buddy in Congress from Louisiana's 5th District, he's the one that gave me the bug. And he said, because we were working a lot of aviation issues together. And I thought, to better understand it, I need to put my hands on it. I guess it was just kind of that DNA, that military mindset, go out and put your hands on it, see what it is. So I started to get exposed to it and learn to fly. I did an immersion course while I was still serving in Congress. And I started on a Monday and soloed on a Friday. My tongue was hanging out of my mouth. I took 6 days off. It was during one of the summer breaks, and went and did that. So I had one of the quickest starts of flying and one of the world's slowest finishes, because serving in Congress, you can't align your time, your schedule, weather, plane, instructor, it's just impossible. But when I got out, I had the time, and so I finished. I got my ticket, and I did that. I've got a couple of 100 hours now, and am enjoying flying, which just shows you're never too old to try new things and extend your brain and reach out and do new things. So I've enjoyed that. I started a nonprofit in March of this past year called the Redeemed Flying Corps. One of the things I learned in my aviation work and issues was the aviation shortages in the military were extreme. In general aviation, they were extreme for pilots. So we looked for ways that we could also extend that to missionary flying. Um, there's a handful of missionary organizations that support a lot of different denominations and churches, missionaries around the world, but they're 30 to 40% short in their cockpits. Um, they're older, they're aging out. There's no real recruitment method. Aviation is expensive. So we created a nonprofit called the Redeemed Flying Corps. It's, no pun intended, but it's really taken off. And we are
Good.
we've got 4 students, 2 have soloed, one's gotten his license just since May. We have 8 total students that we're training now, and we're looking to charter and expand what we're doing with that. And we get donations to help put them in the sky so that they're not burdened. Two of them that soloed were 17 years old. So we're just trying to get them interested in it. And it's exciting to see what has happened with that. And then I'm serving as the executive and teaching pastor at First Southern Baptist Church in Oklahoma City. Was the church, my home church growing up in. And I never thought that I would use my ministry credentials vocationally again. I did in college as a youth minister. And so it's a real honor to do that. The meanest people in church are nicer than most people in politics. So, it's still pretty good. And I've found that, the work is very rewarding. I get to tell people, I really have the best job in the world because I get to tell people how to reconcile their lives with God through Jesus Christ. And it's awesome. So that has kept me busy. I still own my rifle company, but I don't.
Yeah, I meant to ask you about that as well.
Yeah, we had the best year ever this last year, but I don't do the daily operations with it. I'm a passive owner. One of the things when you're elected, Congress takes your life literally away from you. I had 6 active contracts still with Premier Speakers Bureau as a national speaker. Speaking was my main living because of the Saddam capture and leadership and all of that prior to my entry into Congress. That all got taken away when I got elected. And the same way with my business. I had to cut all ties with the operations, the decision-making, all of that. So I learned a lot of what happens to people in Congress when they get elected. It's not, those emails that go around, everybody believes. And so as I came back out of Congress, there was no need to insert myself back into the operations of it. It was running fine. And so I still own the company, but I don't do any of the operations or dealing with it anymore. I still keep up with what's going on, obviously, but so all of that has kept me busy. I am speaking again, although the virus has certainly slowed down people's conferencing and meeting and doing different things. I did go out to San Diego in November was my last speaking event. I had one this week. It was supposed to be, but they delayed that because of the virus. And so we'll all as a nation get back to normal once people have the vaccines or take off the masks, get back to actually seeing each other and relating to one another. We'll get back to all that. I'm confident.
So another thing that's kind of played in a little bit to your work at your church, but you also mentioned a bit earlier before we started the interview about some of the big issues going on today. A lot of division, a lot of strife between both sides since you've left Congress, culminated in essentially as you saw, people breaking into the Capitol. So my question for you is, how can we take politics out of the equation and really use personal faith, which is a connection many people share across parties, in your sense, to bring us back together again as a country?
Well, I tried to provide some warnings about it my final year in Congress on the House floor. I gave a speech, of if George Washington were here, what counsel would he give us as a nation? I also talked to the meaning of Christmas and looking at the faith of our presidents, all the way up to President Obama and different things. So we've forgotten how to care for one another as a country. You know, political conversion is not going to get us there. I mean, it's just not, because the pendulum always swings. And so now what are we, 8 or 9 seat difference in the House, 50-50 in the Senate. We're as divided ever historically, short of civil war, as we ever have been in the Congress. That's a concern. We've got one political party that decides, okay, no, we don't have to respect authority and law enforcement and the institutions. And then the other side, you would think, would be the opposite of that, and they attack the institutions over the authority. And, you know, so we've really lost our way as a nation. It's dangerous. We could lose it. We really could. That's what's scary. I devoted 3.5 decades in service to my nation in some very hard things. And I'm hoping that the calmer minds prevail. We've forgotten how to have conversation. We imagine, you know, I negotiated in some of the toughest environments, wartime environments, with people literally shelling each other's towns and killing each other. And you're sitting there, you know, inhaling their cigarette smoke and going through all the stuff, trying to get them to knock it off. And if you can bring parties like that together, yeah, we can do it. But you can't negotiate from your differences. You can't negotiate the non-negotiables. And that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to negotiate the non-negotiables on each side of the aisle. And then when we can't negotiate the non-negotiables, we're trying to use brute force. You know, we're using character assassination, physical force in many cases. You know, it's just not the way to go. I had somebody tell me early in my political life, when there were some differences going on and it got a little heated, and I said, you know, something to the effect, you know, we need to, you know, we need to tone it down. We need to try to learn to listen to each other. And this one lawmaker, he says, well, look, you know, this is a blood sport, and if you can't take it, and I interrupted him, and I said, no, I said, I've lived blood sport. This isn't anything like it. And when I said that, he apologized and he backed off. But it's that mentality. I've seen the cruelest things that human beings can do to one another and participated in that, you know, as part of the nation's sword. And it's horrible. Why would we want to go there? Why would we want to do those things? When I was in Congress, we found a way to work across the aisle in a rare group that is only sadly getting smaller, which is the Combat Veterans of Congress. And Seth Moulton and I, we founded an organization while we were in Congress. I don't know that if it's even still operating, but it was combat. It was just the, you know, the Combat Veterans. And we knew that we could rally around certain things because of our service to the country. And so we worked on a number of issues together in that. And we only had, 97 members at that time in both houses combined had even served a day in uniform. And of that, maybe a third had actually seen battle. So we wanted to focus on those that had seen battle, work within that. And we knew that, okay, these are people that had clearly put the nation ahead of themselves and worked there. And it was effective. We were able to do some real policy changes to include on the NDAA, the defense authorization, and some other stuff. So that was one attempt that I did while we were in Congress. Out of Congress, I've tried to get people to tone it down. You know, quit looking at people as the enemy and start looking at them as having genuine query. And if you're not comfortable enough to know what you believe to explain it to somebody else, then you probably don't know what you think or what you believe. Mm-hmm. And if we're out there on scan, not sensing the needs of others, caring, have a love of our country, we're not going to solve it. We're not going to solve it with brute force, because what happens is when you have differences and you're not willing to work in the overlapping circles, then you isolate from one another. And we did that for a long time. We're past isolation now. And then you move from isolation and you move to, castigation, where you disparage one another. And then after that, it moves to intimidation. And then when you can't get it by intimidation, then you do it. Sadly, you see it in the patterns of nations that even results all the way to extermination. Um, and so you have to decide, all right, if we're not going to exterminate each other and we're not going to be hurtful and cruel to one another, then at what point do we back it off? At what point do we start putting the circles back together and work within just the ring of the overlap, the space that's in between? Maybe that's all we got, but you work it from there. We have to decide, where are we going to do that? And I have to say, and I'm at the tail end of the baby boomer generation, but I think the quicker we can get my generation out of power, the better. I really believe that. Why? Because my generation, they either went to Woodstock or they went to Vietnam, and they've been fighting about it ever since, in terms of political division. We've been very self-indulgent. We've been, very self-reliant, thinking that we had it all. We've abandoned commitment, commitment to marriage, commitment to job, commitment to nation, all of those things. Very selfish generation. We'll never be called the greatest generation, that's for sure. And then I look at my kids that are largely you guys' age or close there too. Raised five, so it's fascinating to watch how they interact in society. And whereas my generation, you might ask and say, well, hey, what are you working on? Oh, this. You need any help? Nope, I got it. I'm good. Thanks. Whereas I look at my kids' generation and say, well, what are you working on this? It's like, oh, cool. Can I help? Sure. Can I invite a friend? Yeah. Next thing you know, you got 15 people working on it. And that's good for our country. The sharing of ideas, but there's things we could learn from each other. We could show how to complete tasks and get things done in my generation, and then in the younger generations now that are entering the political base and entering key jobs and sectors and employment for our country. They could learn from that leadership. They could learn from that task accomplishment and the completion of tasks, not just the idea of task or the idea of starting new things, but actually finishing them. But then we could learn an awful lot from the younger generation that, hey, I had one millennial tell me at a town hall, I'll never forget, it was very insightful. She said, yeah, we're sick of all of you, meaning politicians at large. And I said, all right, tell me more. And she says, well, all the bickering. She says, you remind us of our divorced parents. And I thought, there's some wisdom coming out of that lady's mouth. And so I think that the younger generation is looking for commitment. They're not looking for abandonment. They are looking for things that will last and have durability. But sadly, we've been so polarized in my generation that we haven't inspired or shown anybody the way to get to it. And so it's leaving people a little bit disillusioned. But we can't go there. I've been to all 50 states. I've been to, 60, 70 countries around the world. The United States has amazing people, and we have tremendous capacity, untold resources and wealth in our land. There's nothing that we could not accomplish if we could learn how to work together. And we got to do that. So you guys make that happen, and forget how we're screwing it up, and learn from our lessons, and hopefully we can get to that.
Thank you. Armin, do you have any final thoughts or questions?
No, that was great. I've really thoroughly enjoyed listening to that. So.